Cops pulled over a woman for no reason, but froze when her husband showed up with a badge. Rachel Carter never wanted to be the center of a storm. She was just running errands on a humid Atlanta evening. Little did she know, 2 patrol officers had their sights set on pulling her over for the flimsiest of reasons. What begins as an ordinary traffic stop spirals into a tense standoff of power, prejudice, and intimidation. With each passing minute, Rachel's fear grows. And then her husband, Mark Carter, an off-duty detective, arrives. Badge in hand, he radiates authority. The moment the officers see who they've been harassing, their smug confidence evaporates. They realize too late that they've tangled with the wrong family. Rachel Carter glanced at the time, glowing on her car's dashboard, 8:56 p.m. She had hoped to be home by now, already changed into comfortable clothes for the evening. But life rarely unfolds so neatly. After a busy day at her office job in Midtown Atlanta, she'd volunteered to pick up groceries for the weekend. Mark, her husband, was pulling a late shift at the precinct, so it made sense for her to grab the essentials before heading home. The city's warmth clung to everything. Even after sunset, Atlanta's summer air felt heavy, as though refusing to cool down. Rachel loved the city, but nights like these reminded her of how relentless Georgia's climate could be. Her thoughts wandered as she turned onto a side street lined with small shops, a mural of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. painted on the side of a corner bodega. She and Mark used to stroll this area when they were newlyweds, grabbing Coca-Cola floats at a mom and pop diner on the weekends. In those days, Mark was a fresh-faced recruit at the Atlanta Police Department, brimming with idealism. Now, nearly a decade later, he was a seasoned detective, having seen both the best and worst of humanity. But if this day had taught Rachel anything, it was that the mundane could pivot to the dramatic in a heartbeat. She recalled how, earlier in the afternoon, she'd received a frantic text from her sister in Houston, something about an unexpected medical bill. Rachel tried to help from afar, feeling grateful that Mark's job provided a degree of financial security. Yet her heart ached at the anxiety in her sister's voice. Problems never seemed to run out. As she passed under a flickering street lamp, she noticed a patrol car in her rearview mirror. It trailed at a steady distance, its headlights illuminating the inside of her car. A small wave of unease rippled through her. She'd done nothing wrong, but it was hard not to tense up. Her driver's license and registration were up to date, and her taillights worked perfectly. She mentally ran through possible reasons they might be following her, coming up blank. Sighing, she turned left onto a quieter road, leading toward her neighborhood, but the patrol car followed. Her nerves began to hum with caution. After a moment, the red and blue lights flared to life, cutting through the humid darkness. A siren whooped once, twice. Heart-thudding, Rachel signaled and pulled over to the curb. For a second she glanced at her phone on the passenger seat. Should she call Mark? Maybe it was a routine stop, though. For what? She couldn't guess. She considered the situation carefully. Wait until the officer approached, remain calm, and hope this was just a misunderstanding. Yet the pounding in her chest wouldn't subside. She switched off the engine, exhaled shakily, and prepared to face whatever came next. Through her side mirror, Rachel watched the patrol car door open. A tall, broad-shouldered officer emerged, adjusting his belt as he walked. The name tag read Carver. Behind him, another officer, slightly shorter and stockier, named Milton, followed, shining a flashlight along the street as if searching for something. Their demeanor made it seem more like a manhunt than a routine traffic stop. Rachel rolled down her window about halfway. She placed both hands on the steering wheel in plain sight, recalling Mark's advice, always keep your hands visible and move slowly. Her heart hammered in her ears. Officer Carver approached first. He leaned in, gaze sweeping over the car interior before settling on Rachel. "License and registration," he said. curtly, not bothering with pleasantries or even stating a reason for the stop. "Good evening, officer," Rachel managed, trying to keep her voice steady. She reached carefully into her bag, extracting her wallet and then her driver's license. Next, she opened the glove compartment for the registration. Even as she moved, the second officer's flashlight tracked her every motion. The tension felt electric. Carver snatched the documents from her hand. "Miss Carter, is it?" He glanced at the license. "Miss S. Carter." "Rachel Carter, yes." He nodded, glancing over at Officer Milton. "Why are you out this late?" Rachel blinked at the question. "I was just running errands. I'm heading home now." Carver narrowed his eyes. "Where's home for you?" "Cloverdale Heights, off Westmont Avenue," she replied, her breath catching. Normally, she wouldn't be so hesitant, but the officer's aggressive tone unsettled her. Officer Milton circled around the front of her car, shining his flashlight on the tires, the hood, the corners of the windshield, as if searching for contraband. "We've had reports of suspicious vehicles in the area," he muttered, though it felt like a vague justification. He peered into the back seat through the window. All he'd see were groceries and a folded-up umbrella. Rachel frowned slightly. "I'm not aware of any suspicious activity, officer. I just—" Carver cut her off. "MAAM, step out of the vehicle." Her stomach lurched. This was escalating far too quickly. She'd answered their questions, offered her documents, but they were treating her like a suspect in a serious crime. "Officer, is there a specific reason you need me to exit my car? Are you resisting my instructions?" Carver barked, ignoring her question. "Do I need to repeat myself?" Rachel swallowed hard. She knew from Mark's stories that refusing an officer's commands could be dangerous. Still, she wasn't sure if she had any legal ground to remain in the car. "No, I'm not resisting," she said softly. She unbuckled her seatbelt, her pulse roaring in her ears, and opened the door. She stood on the sidewalk, the summer air feeling suddenly stifling. Officer Milton joined Carver, the two of them looming over her. "Turn around," Milton ordered. When she hesitated, he practically grabbed her shoulder, spinning her slightly. The movement wasn't overtly violent, but it was forceful enough to jolt her. Panic flared in her chest. "Is this really necessary?" Rachel asked, voice trembling. She thought of Mark, of how outraged he'd be if he saw this. She thought of calling him, but her phone was still in the car, locked away from her immediate reach. Carver patted her down, presumably checking for weapons. "Don't see anything," he muttered. "Check the trunk." Officer Milton stepped away, moving toward the trunk. Rachel wanted to protest there was no probable cause, no reason for a search, but fear stilled her tongue. Her eyes flicked from Carver to Milton and back again, dread prickling her skin. This was beyond a routine stop. Her mind spun with questions. What do they think I've done? Or worse, is this about intimidation? Are they simply looking for a target? In that moment, under the glare of flashing lights, Rachel Carter realized she was alone on a dark street, subject to the whims of two cops who offered no explanation. She whispered a silent prayer that Mark would sense something was wrong, or that someone else would notice and intervene, because right now, the whole situation felt precarious, as if it could tip into something far more dangerous at any second. Mark Carter ended his meeting at the downtown precinct, feeling more mentally drained than usual. He was a detective in the Special Investigations Unit, dealing with everything from high-profile robberies to internal misconduct cases. Tonight had been particularly exhausting, full of departmental politics and never-ending paperwork. As he gathered his notes, he noticed a missed call from Rachel. He frowned. Rachel rarely called during work hours, unless it was important. Quickly he texted her, "Hey babe, I'm heading home soon, everything okay?" The 3 dots on his phone screen indicated she was typing, but then they disappeared. No reply arrived. A twinge of unease settled in his stomach, but he brushed it aside. She'd probably just gotten busy, or was driving. Stepping outside into the night air, Mark felt the lingering humidity typical Atlanta summer. He made his way across the parking lot, thinking about how Rachel often teased him for thriving in chaos. He'd grown used to dealing with criminals, but one thing that never ceased to terrify him was the possibility of something happening to the people he loved. He tried to shove the thought away, unlocking his car. As he slid into the driver's seat, his phone buzzed. Not a text from Rachel, but from a colleague. The message read, "Hey, about that suspicious stop near Piedmont and Roswell, heard you might want to check it out." Mark's forehead creased. Why would someone text him specifically about a suspicious traffic stop, unless they suspected something was off, or it might involve someone he knew? He dialed his colleague's number. "Hey man, what's going on? Sorry if this is out of left field," his colleague said. "I was monitoring radio chatter and heard 2 uniformed officers pulled over a car with the license plate matching yours on file, the one registered to your wife. It might be nothing, but they're running her info now." Mark's pulse quickened. "Which officers?" "Sounds like Carver and Milton. They called in a 1028 on her plate. I overheard your name in the system, so I figured you'd want to know." Mark clenched his jaw. Carver had a reputation for being overly aggressive on stops, with multiple complaints of harassment. Milton wasn't much better, rumored to be easily swayed by Carver's hot-headed style. "I appreciate the heads up. Do me a favor, text me the location." Hanging up, Mark felt a surge of alarm. Why would they stop Rachel? She's meticulous about her driving. Without wasting another second, he started his engine and peeled out of the precinct parking lot, adrenaline thundering in his veins. Meanwhile, at the roadside, Rachel shivered despite the heat. Milton stood near the open trunk, rummaging through her groceries as if expecting to find contraband. "Nothing here but bananas, cereal, and some veggies," he muttered with disappointment. Carver ignored his partner's commentary, focusing on Rachel. "What were you really doing tonight?" he pressed. "Got any receipts to prove you just shopped?" Rachel inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay calm. "Yes, in one of the bags. This is a Publix near Crescent Avenue. I can," Carver scoffed. "We don't need you rummaging in your bags. We'll find what we need ourselves. Why are you being defensive anyway?" "I'm not," Rachel managed, her voice quavering. "I just don't understand why." "Don't you raise your tone at me," Carver snapped, stepping closer. He towered over her, face contorted with hostility. Rachel's heart pounded. She felt cornered, powerless. A small group of onlookers had gathered across the street, keeping their distance but watching with concern. Just as Rachel braced for yet another aggressive question, a distant roar of an engine turned her head. A familiar car screeched to a stop under the halo of streetlights. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped Mark, his badge visibly clipped to his belt, his expression livid. Rachel felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The officers, on the other hand, froze. Recognition flitted across Carver's face. He'd certainly seen Mark around the department. And now that same man was striding toward them, determination blazing in his eyes. "Rachel!" Mark's voice boomed, echoing off the nearby buildings. He covered the short distance in a matter of seconds, ignoring the startled looks from Carver and Milton. His badge caught the glow of the flashing lights, an unmistakable emblem of authority. Rachel turned to face him, struggling against the swirl of relief and anxiety surging through her. "Mark, thank God. These officers pulled me over and," before she could finish, Mark gently guided her behind him, positioning himself between her and the 2 uniformed cops. He glared at Carver first, then at Milton, scanning their postures and the expression on their faces. Both officers seemed momentarily speechless. "What the hell is going on here?" Mark demanded, voice low but charged with suppressed fury. "Why did you stop my wife? And why are you searching her vehicle without a clear cause?" Carver's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked as though he couldn't decide whether to stand his ground or back down. "Detective Carter," he said, forcing a semblance of calm, "we recognized the plate as belonging to you eventually. But we'd already initiated the stop under suspicion of—" "Suspicion of what?" Mark cut him off sharply. "You had no probable cause. If you had, I'd like to hear it." Milton cleared his throat. "We, observed her driving erratically. We just wanted to ensure no intoxication or anything else." Rachel's eyes flashed in indignation. "I wasn't driving erratically at all. I signaled every turn. I was going just under the speed limit." Mark faced Milton, expression uncompromising. "There was no sign of impairment, and yet you pulled her out of the car. You searched her trunk and even patted her down?" His words bristled with each syllable. Carver bristled, trying to reclaim the upper hand. "We're within our rights to perform a search if we suspect contraband or a threat to officer safety. Don't feed me textbook lines," Mark snapped. "You know we need reasonable suspicion for that, and rummaging through groceries isn't exactly standard procedure." He took a step closer, unflinching, though he maintained professional composure. "I'll be asking for the dashcam footage and your bodycam recordings. If I find any irregularities, any sign of harassment or profiling, there will be consequences." Somewhere in the back of Mark's mind, he realized a small crowd was forming. Neighbors, passers-by, and maybe a few folks filming with their phones. This was quickly becoming a public spectacle. But Mark's priority was clear: protect Rachel and hold these officers accountable. Carver's face reddened. "Look, we didn't know she was your wife when and that's supposed to excuse your behavior?" Mark retorted, cutting him off again. "You should treat every citizen with respect, not just your fellow officers' families." An awkward silence fell. Even Milton looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot. Their initial bravado had evaporated. Now confronted by a detective, and one with a fierce reputation for honesty, they seemed unsure how to extricate themselves from the mess they'd made. Mark turned to Rachel, his hand gently gripping her arm as if to reassure her that she was safe. "Get in your car," he said softly. "I'll wrap this up." She nodded, exhaling shakily, and moved toward her driver's seat. The two officers exchanged uncomfortable glances but didn't protest. Mark then faced them again, voice cold as steel. "I expect your full reports on my desk by tomorrow morning. In the meantime, if either of you tries to fabricate a story, know that I'll be checking every detail. Are we clear?" Carver opened his mouth, but only managed a strained, "Yes, sir." Mark nodded curtly. "Good. Now turn off your lights and let my wife go about her business." Defeated, Carver motioned to Milton. The flashing blues died, leaving only the dull glow of street lamps. Mark watched as they trudged back to their squad car, tension radiating from their stiff postures. As they pulled away, Mark could feel adrenaline coursing through his veins. He turned, noticing the onlookers dispersing, some smiling or giving him nods of approval. Rachel stepped out again, walking around to him. She was visibly shaken, tears threatening to spill. "You okay?" he asked, his tone softening in an instant. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I just want to go home. I was so scared, Mark." He wrapped an arm around her. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Let's get you home. We'll handle the rest in the morning." And so, with hearts still pounding, they left that dimly lit street behind, unaware that this encounter was only the spark that would set off a much larger firestorm of departmental reckoning. Early the next morning, Rachel awoke, feeling like her nerves were still rattling. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioner. Normally she loved this time of day, fresh coffee, the golden light filtering in through the blinds, but today her stomach knotted with residual stress. She found Mark in the kitchen, already dressed in his plainclothes detective attire, tie slightly askew. He was leaning over his laptop at the table, scowling at something on the screen. The smell of dark roast coffee hung in the air, but the usual comfort it brought felt distant. "Morning," Rachel said softly, padding over to him. "Any updates?" He straightened, meeting her eyes with concern. "I've got a meeting at the precinct to address what happened last night. Commander Weiss wants a full report from me, Carver, and Milton. We're supposed to meet with internal affairs afterward." Rachel swallowed, the memory of being pressed against her car fresh in her mind. What? What does that mean? Will they be punished? Mark sipped his coffee, then set the mug down with a weary sigh. "I can't say for sure. There's a process. But given that I directly witnessed their misconduct, and the department already has multiple complaints about them, I'd say they're in trouble." She inhaled, relief mingling with unease. "I hope it leads to real accountability. It was terrifying, Mark. They treated me like I was a criminal." He nodded, setting a hand gently on her shoulder. "I know. That's not how policing is supposed to work. I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner." He paused, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "I keep replaying it in my head. If I'd answered my phone earlier." She slipped her hand into his. "Don't blame yourself. You showed up when I needed you most." He gave her hand a squeeze, then glanced at his watch. "I've got to go. Are you okay to be home alone for a bit? I can have someone swing by." Rachel mustered a smile. "I'll be fine. I might call my sister or a friend, just so I'm not dwelling on it alone." Mark returned the smile, albeit faintly, then headed out. Rachel listened as the door closed and the house sank back into silence. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, letting the quiet settle in. Still wearing her pajamas, she wandered to the living room, phone in hand. She thumbed through her social media feed, hoping for something light or distracting. Instead, an old acquaintance had posted a video from last night. Crazy scene on Piedmont. Woman pulled over by cops. Then husband, who's a detective, shows up. The clip, barely a minute long, showed the tail end of the confrontation. The comment section was already ablaze with speculation, supportive remarks, and the occasional nasty comment about cops protecting their own. Her stomach twisted. Seeing it from an outside perspective was surreal. She read a few of the remarks, her heart pounding at the idea that this moment so personal and frightening was now public. People were outraged on her behalf, which felt validating but also exposed. She set the phone down, feeling a swirl of emotions. The coffee in the pot sat untouched. She couldn't bring herself to eat or drink. Instead, she went to take a shower, letting the steam and hot water attempt to wash away the tension. But even as the water cascaded over her, she knew the sense of invasion and injustice wouldn't rinse off so easily. By the time she dried her hair and changed into casual clothes, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Mark, meeting in progress. "Will call you soon. Love you." She sighed, grateful at least for his presence, even if from afar. She remembered the trembling in his voice when he arrived on the scene. He'd been furious, protective, and worried. For now, all she could do was wait. Wait and hope that the system Mark believed in, the one she had long supported, would do the right thing. She knew from Mark's stories that not all cops were like Carver and Milton. Many truly wanted to help people. But the question gnawing at her now was, would the badge protect them, or would justice prevail? Mark Carter stepped into the precinct's grey, nondescript conference room, a wave of tension following in his wake. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow across the long table, where a few key figures had already gathered. Commander Weiss, a stalwart presence in the department for over 20 years, sat at the head. Across from her were Carver and Milton, looking decidedly less confident than the night before. Next to them, two men from the Internal Affairs, Unit Lieutenant Maxwell and Sergeant Ortega, studied the open files in front of them. Mark took a seat opposite Carver, trying to contain his simmering anger. "Commander," Weiss cleared her throat. "All right, let's get this underway. Detective Carter, Officers Carver and Milton, you're here for a preliminary review of the events that took place last night." Carver shifted uncomfortably, while Milton kept his gaze locked on the table. Mark folded his arms. "Yes, ma'am." Weiss flipped through some documents. According to initial reports, Miss S. Rachel Carter was pulled over for alleged erratic driving. However, the dashboard footage from the officer's cruiser shows no significant traffic violation. Moreover, there was a search of her vehicle. This was done without a clear statement of probable cause. Maxwell from Internal Affairs spoke up next, his voice clipped. "Officers Carver and Milton, can you explain your rationale for conducting a search?" Carver cleared his throat. "We observed a suspicious lane change. She drifted a bit, so we suspected possible DUI or involvement in, well, some recent break-ins have been happening around that area." Mark clenched his jaw, wanting to interject, but forced himself to wait for a clear chance. Sergeant Ortega eyed Carver. "The dashcam shows you behind her for about a quarter mile, during which she signaled properly and stayed within the speed limit. There's no swerving on record. And the break-ins you're referencing occurred in a completely different district." Milton mumbled, "We had reason to suspect she might be transporting something illegal." Mark couldn't hold back anymore. "Reason or hunch? You rummaged through groceries and insisted on a pat down." "For groceries, Milton? Where was the probable cause?" The tension in the room thickened. Carver's face reddened, and he shot a glance at Milton, who looked equally flustered. "We used our discretion," Carver sputtered. "Discretion," Mark repeated bitterly. "At best, it was an abuse of power. At worst, it was profiling or intimidation." Weiss rapped her knuckles on the table to maintain order. "I've read the transcripts from the bodycam audio. There were no mentions of any specific evidence that would prompt a full search. In fact, it appears your questions were antagonistic, focusing on trying to catch Miss S. Carter in a lie rather than clarifying any real suspicion." Maxwell nodded. "Given the severity of the allegations and the preliminary evidence, Internal Affairs will conduct a formal investigation. Officers Carver and Milton, you'll remain on administrative leave pending its outcome." Carver's eyes widened. "What? That's not..." Weiss held up a hand. "You'll have every opportunity to present your side, officer. But for now, we must uphold protocol. I won't tolerate rogue procedures on my watch." Mark stared at the two officers. He saw fear flicker behind Carver's defiance. For a second, Mark almost pitied them caught in a situation they'd arrogantly assumed would never come back to haunt them. But then he remembered Rachel's trembling voice and felt his resolve harden. As the meeting adjourned, Maxwell and Ortega collected their files, indicating they'd be in touch with each party. Commander Weiss walked out, phone already in hand. Carver and Milton headed toward the door, shooting Mark glares. Mark remained seated until they left. Then, with a weary exhale, he closed his eyes and thought of Rachel at home, how he wished this ordeal was already over. Little did any of them know, the ripple effects of this incident would soon reach beyond a simple internal investigation, exposing deeper flaws in the system. But for now, Mark simply prayed that the department would stand for what was right, and that this wasn't the calm before an even bigger storm. After the tense meeting, Mark tried to lose himself in his usual workload, cross-referencing evidence from ongoing burglary investigations, sorting through tips on suspected narcotics trafficking near the Beltline. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Rachel, to Carver and Milton's resentful faces, and to the simmering discontent within the precinct walls. By lunch, Mark's phone was abuzz with texts from colleagues offering mixed reactions. Some commended him for standing up to Carver and Milton, who had been on the radar for questionable stops before. Others cautioned him to tread lightly, warning that certain officers wouldn't appreciate seeing their own under the microscope. One message came from an old friend, Sergeant Elaine Brooks, who'd been in the department nearly as long as Mark. "Be careful, Mark. Some folks think you're making them look bad. They're stirring rumors. He stared at the message, a knot forming in his stomach. Rumors about what? That he was taking advantage of his position to push an agenda? That Rachel had fabricated her side of the story? His jaw tightened. Let them talk, he told himself. The footage was clear, the facts indisputable. But, despite his resolve, he felt the undercurrent of tension creeping closer. Later that afternoon, he bumped into Carver in the hallway. The officer was packing up a box of personal items from his desk, clearly preparing for administrative leave. Their eyes locked in a moment of uncomfortable intensity. "Hope you're satisfied," Carver muttered, voice low. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." Mark frowned. "I didn't fabricate anything, Carver. You brought this on yourself by harassing my wife." Carver snorted. "Right, harassment. Any other driver wouldn't have made a fuss. But your wife calls you, and suddenly I'm on leave." His gaze hardened. "Watch yourself, Carter. You're not the only one in this department with connections." Mark bristled, stepping forward. "Was that a threat?" Carver looked away, shrugging. "Just a fact. Some people see you as a hero, but others, they think you've gone soft, too quick to side with so-called victims. Keep that in mind." With that, Carver brushed past, heading toward the elevator. Mark stood there, grappling with anger and a tinge of worry. He'd known a handful of officers who resented him for pushing back against misconduct. But the idea that they'd unify against him over this incident rattled him more than he cared to admit. By the time Mark got home, it was nearly dusk. He found Rachel in the living room, reading articles on her tablet. She looked up with relief when he walked in. "Hey," she said softly, "any progress?" He set down his keys, sinking into the sofa beside her. Carver and Milton are on leave while Internal Affairs does their thing. But there's pushback from some corners of the department. He hesitated, then continued, "I want you to be extra cautious. If you notice anything strange, someone following you or weird calls, let me know immediately." Rachel's eyes widened slightly. "You think it might come to that?" Mark exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to scare you, but these guys, they have their own circle, and some of them feel emboldened in the worst ways. Just promise me you'll stay vigilant." She nodded, her expression serious. "I will." Silence settled between them, both recalling the moment under those flashing lights when she felt so vulnerable. Mark reached for her hand, squeezing it reassuringly. He wasn't going to let fear dictate their lives, but he also couldn't ignore the truth. In a department as large as the Atlanta PD, pockets of toxicity could breed trouble. A single complaint had toppled careers before, and now Mark had placed the crosshairs on himself by refusing to look away. "Let's order takeout and watch something light," Rachel suggested gently, as if reading his thoughts. "We could both use a break." Mark smiled, grateful for her steady presence. "That sounds perfect." Yet as they settled in for the evening, the weight of Carver's parting words still lingered in Mark's mind. "Watch yourself, Carter." The line echoed like a cautionary drumbeat. Part of him dismissed it as idle bluster, but another part couldn't shake the sense that a fuse had been lit and the explosion was still yet to come. Mark spent the following week juggling his usual caseload with the swirling controversy around Rachel's stop. Internal Affairs systematically interviewed both Carver and Milton, as well as Rachel. Mark himself provided a detailed statement of what he observed upon arriving. Commander Weiss, determined to uphold departmental integrity, scrutinized every detail of the incident. Amid this heightened scrutiny, an unexpected development arose. Sergeant Elaine Brooks uncovered a string of old complaints against Carver. Some dated back 5 years, alleging everything from intimidation tactics to questionable searches. Most had been quietly closed, citing lack of evidence. Now, with the added spotlight, these cases were being revisited. When Elaine confided this in Mark, he couldn't help but feel a grim sense of validation. Carver had a pattern, it seemed, but it also meant the fight would be even more intense. Carver wouldn't go down without slinging mud back at anyone who challenged him. One late afternoon, Mark received a call from a name he hadn't heard in years, Detective James Howell, once an internal affairs investigator who'd left the department under murky circumstances. Curiosity piqued, Mark answered. Mark Carter, Howell's deep voice rumbled. Long time, no talk. Heard you have your hands full with Carver. Thought I'd offer some insight. Mark recalled Howell's reputation for digging deep into departmental rot, a trait that often made him enemies. James, it's been a while. You left APD, didn't you? Howell let out a humorless chuckle. I left after hitting too many brick walls, but that doesn't mean I stopped paying attention. Word is Carver's linked to certain individuals who profit from turning a blind eye, like maybe allowing certain property crimes to go unreported for a price. Mark felt a prickle of alarm. That's a serious accusation. You have proof? Bits and pieces. Nothing that stuck years ago. But maybe now, with him under the spotlight, it'll be easier to connect the dots. A pause. I'm willing to share what I have, if you think it'll help. I never got justice for some of those victims. This might be the chance. Mark's grip tightened on the phone. So Carver wasn't just an aggressive street cop. He might be involved in actual corruption. Mark tried to keep his voice steady. Send me what you've got. Discreetly, I'll see where it fits. After the call ended, Mark stared at the phone in a mixture of excitement and dread. If Carver was indeed involved in deeper corruption, then the traffic stop that night might have been just the tip of the iceberg. Taking Carver down could lead to unraveling a whole network of wrongdoing, but it could also place Mark and Rachel at greater risk. That evening, he pulled Rachel aside. We might be dealing with more than just an illegal search, he explained carefully. There's a possibility Carver's got bigger skeletons in his closet. Rachel's eyes widened. What does that mean for us? Mark exhaled slowly. It means if we press forward, we might stir up a hornet's nest. But turning a blind eye isn't an option. If Carver and his allies are hurting people, enabling crimes, I can't stand by. She took his hand, expression resolute despite flickers of anxiety. I understand, but promise me you'll be careful. Don't rush in alone. He nodded, pulling her close. I promise. Yet, as the sun set outside their window, Mark felt the weight of the path he was choosing. He'd sworn an oath to protect and serve, and that included rooting out corruption among his own. But doing so might come at a personal cost. The question remained, how far would Carver and his allies go to silence those who challenged them? The next few days blurred into a tense mosaic of developments. Internal affairs accelerated their timeline, spurred by the wave of new leads, suggesting Carver was tied to more than just overzealous traffic stops. One complaint, filed by a local business owner, described how Carver demanded fees for added police protection. Another alleged that stolen goods passed through the trunk of his patrol car, never making it to the evidence locker. Mark spent his off hours combing through the information Detective Howell had shared, emails, scanned documents, and cryptic notes from half a decade ago. Though incomplete, they formed a mosaic of potential wrongdoing, each piece nudging Carver further into the center of a web of corruption. Meanwhile, Rachel tried to resume her normal routine. She returned to work, greeted by sympathetic colleagues who'd seen social media posts about her ordeal. Yet she couldn't shake the nagging fear that lingered every time she passed a patrol car. The trust she once placed in the badge was shaken. One evening, as Mark and Rachel sat down for dinner pizza, delivered after another long day, her phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Silence for a moment. Then a low voice crackled. You think you're special because your husband's a detective? You better watch your back. The line went dead. Heart pounding, Rachel stared at her phone. She felt Mark's concerned gaze. "What happened?" he asked, setting his slice of pizza down. Her voice trembled. "Somebody threatened me, told me to watch my back." Mark's expression darkened. He took her phone, checking the call history. Blocked number. Great. He forced himself to stay calm. "We'll let the station know. See if it can be traced. In the meantime, I want you to be careful, okay? Don't go anywhere alone at night." She nodded, barely touching her food now. "You really think Carver or his buddies would go that far?" Mark grimaced. "I don't want to point fingers without evidence, but it's a possibility." He reached across the table, placing his hand on hers. "We're not backing down. They're scared because the truth is coming out." After dinner, Mark made calls, reporting the threat to his superiors. Commander Weiss instructed him to bring Rachel in for a statement the next morning. She insisted the department would assign extra patrols near their house, though Mark suspected not everyone in uniform was necessarily trustworthy. Later that night, Rachel lay awake, staring at the bedroom ceiling. Mark's steady breathing signaled he'd finally succumbed to exhaustion, but her mind refused to rest. She couldn't stop replaying the voice on the phone, the menacing undertone. "You better watch your back." It felt surreal, like she was trapped in someone else's nightmare. How had a simple traffic stop escalated into a situation where she now feared for her safety? In the hush of midnight, she recalled the stories Mark sometimes shared about officers who covered up for each other, corruption that could go to the highest levels. She used to believe those were exceptions, few and far between. But now it felt too close to home. Eventually, she drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of flashing lights and echoing sirens. Little did she know that in the coming days, the tension would peak, revealing loyalties and betrayals she never imagined. The fight for accountability was about to intensify, and there would be no going back. At dawn, Mark was already up, bleary-eyed but determined. He guided Rachel into the precinct's side entrance, hoping to avoid prying eyes and the rumor mill that seemed to churn in every hallway. They were met by Sergeant Elaine Brooks, who escorted them to a secure conference room. Inside, Commander Weiss and Lieutenant Maxwell from Internal Affairs waited. A third figure, a stern-faced man in a suit, introduced himself as Assistant District Attorney Jonathan Price. The presence of an ADA signaled how serious this had become. Rachel recounted the phone threat in detail, her voice trembling only slightly. "I have no idea who it was, but it felt like a warning. I'm worried it won't stop at just calls." ADA Price exchanged glances with Weiss. "We'll request a phone trace through the proper channels. In the meantime, Miss S. Carter, you're under our protection. Don't hesitate to call if anything suspicious happens again." She nodded, grateful but still uneasy. Next, Mark handed over the compiled documents from Detective Howell, explaining the alleged network of corruption and Carver's suspected involvement. Commander Weiss leaned forward, scanning the pages, her brow furrowing deeper with every paragraph. Maxwell jotted notes, occasionally glancing at Mark with a mix of astonishment and worry. "This is serious," Weiss said at last. "Carver's been a cancer in the department, if even half of this is true. We'll need a thorough investigation, maybe even outside oversight from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation." Maxwell cleared his throat. "That'll shake things up, big time. Some of the names mentioned here are, well, they've been in the department a long time. We need to be sure we're rock solid on evidence." ADA Price nodded. "I can't move forward with indictments unless we have more, possibly witness testimony or a direct link to Carver's finances. We can start requesting bank records, but that may take a while." Mark pressed his palms flat on the table, leaning in. "James Howell might have contacts who can corroborate these claims. If we can find even one officer or civilian who's willing to testify against Carver and his associates, it could break this wide open." Weiss fixed Mark with a firm gaze. But be cautious. If Carver feels cornered, he'll lash out. We can't risk your or Rachel's safety. Understood? Mark nodded, heart pounding. Understood. After the briefing, Rachel waited in the hallway while Mark finished some paperwork. She glanced around, feeling the weight of the building's tension. It was surreal to stand among so many officers, many of whom were upstanding, while knowing a dangerous faction operated within these same walls. Suddenly, a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see Officer Milton, looking a mix of embarrassed and apologetic. He approached cautiously, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one else was watching. Miss Esser. Carter, he began, voice low. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. That night, it was Carver's idea to push so hard. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't stop him. Her stomach twisted. You still participated, he looked down. I know, and I feel terrible, but I didn't realize who your husband was or how deep Carver's connections went. Now I see how messed up everything is. Rachel studied him, uncertain if this was genuine remorse or fear-driven confession. So why are you telling me this? I want to come clean. I might talk to Internal Affairs. He swallowed hard. Carver threatened me, said if I ratted him out, I'd regret it. But I can't keep covering for him. I'll testify if it means clearing my name and doing the right thing. Rachel's heart fluttered. This could be huge, a direct witness to Carver's misconduct. Then go talk to them, she urged gently. Milton nodded, turning away. For a moment, she saw the weight of guilt on his shoulders. This might be the break we need, she thought, but it also meant Carver would know Milton had flipped, potentially escalating the danger. When Mark emerged, she recounted the encounter. He placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll make sure Internal Affairs interviews him right away. If Milton testifies, we could bring Carver down for good, but both of them sensed the looming danger. Cornered predators are at their most volatile. They'd have to brace for Carver's next move. Officer Milton's statement came swiftly and shook the foundation of the Atlanta Police Department. Under the watchful eye of Internal Affairs and the Assistant District Attorney, he confessed that Carver had orchestrated numerous illegal stops to solicit bribes, confiscate contraband for personal gain, and funnel illicit goods through back channels. He detailed exactly how Carver justified stopping Rachel's car. He wanted a reason to search any random driver that night, anyone who looked an easy mark to intimidate. Though Milton tried to downplay his own culpability, it was clear he'd willingly participated. In exchange for cooperation, he was promised lesser administrative penalties. The spotlight, however, now burned fiercely on Carver. After reviewing Milton's sworn testimony, the department moved swiftly. Internal Affairs filed official misconduct charges, and a judge signed a warrant for Carver's arrest. It was a move that sparked outrage among Carver's few loyalists, but the evidence was mounting too rapidly to ignore. The day of the arrest felt surreal to Mark. He knew it was the right step, yet he also braced himself for backlash from Carver's circle. Rachel, meanwhile, tried to maintain a low profile. She had no desire to become a public figure in the scandal. But local news outlets had picked up the story, featuring her ordeal as the tipping point that exposed a corrupt officer's empire. As Carver was led out of the precinct in handcuffs, a throng of reporters and curious onlookers formed outside. Some shouted questions, while others jeered. Mark stood at a distance, arms folded, watching grimly. Carver caught sight of him, face twisted with fury. Even as officers guided him into a squad car bound for booking, he spat words that Mark couldn't quite hear, but the venom was unmistakable. Commander Weiss joined Mark, exhaling a heavy sigh. This is going to be messy. We'll have to do a top-to-bottom review of every case Carver touched. The mayor's calling for a full audit. Mark nodded, tired but resolute. It's better this way. We need to purge the department of this kind of rot. Weiss offered a tight smile. You did the right thing, detective. And so did your wife. If she hadn't spoken up, who knows how long this would have continued. He nodded again, thinking of Rachel. How she'd gone from a routine grocery run to being at the center of one of the biggest police scandals in recent memory. The entire city seemed to be talking about it, from morning radio shows to the midday cafe chatter at Peachtree Center. Some were shocked that such corruption lurked behind the badge. Others were unsurprised, jaded by stories of police misconduct. But nearly everyone agreed that the Carver case was a wake-up call. That night, Mark returned home to find Rachel sitting on the porch swing, sipping iced tea. The air was still warm, though dusk brought a hint of relief from the heat. He sat beside her, the porch light illuminating the worry lines on her face. "It's done," he said quietly. "Carver's booked. We might have a trial in a few months, depending on how he pleads." She nodded, setting her glass down. "How do you feel?" "Tired," Mark admitted, leaning back against the swing. "Relieved, too, but mostly exhausted. It's been a lot, and it's not entirely over." Rachel slid her hand into his. "I know. I'm proud of you for standing up, for not letting them bully you or me." He squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you too. You showed so much courage. And now, maybe we can start moving forward." They sat in silence, the cricket song filling the gaps. The night sky stretched above, dotted with the faint glow of stars that managed to pierce the city's light pollution. For the first time since the ordeal began, Mark felt a tentative sense of peace. There were still challenges ahead: hearings, departmental reforms, the trial, but Carver was no longer a free man to harass and intimidate. The scales of karma had started to balance. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, but tonight he allowed himself a moment of rest, heartened by the knowledge that justice, while never simple, was finally being served. The summer sun rose over Atlanta's skyline, casting long golden beams across the streets that had once echoed with the wail of sirens and the hum of tension. In the days following Carver's arrest, the department was abuzz with talk of change. Younger officers, inspired by the swift action, felt hopeful. Veteran officers, some relieved and others wary, recognized the departure of a toxic presence might lead to stricter accountability for all. Internal Affairs continued their deep dive, unearthing more instances of Carver's misconduct and, in the process, discovering a few other officers complicit in lesser schemes. ADA Price prepared for a trial that promised to draw heavy media coverage as Carver's defense team threatened to expose institutional failures and systemic hypocrisy. Yet that narrative held little water now that evidence painted Carver as the primary instigator. Mark found himself in a new position, simultaneously praised as a hero by those who valued integrity and scorned by a small faction who believed he'd betrayed the blue wall. The friction was tangible, but Commander Weiss stood firmly behind him. The mayor publicly commended his commitment to justice, and the city council announced plans to review the Atlanta Police Department's policies on stops and searches. Amid this swirl of change, Rachel emerged from the shadows of fear. The community around her, the local grocery store cashier who recognized her, the neighbors who stopped to chat, offered words of support and relief that someone had faced down the abuse of power. She returned to normalcy step by step, though the memory of that night's terror would never fully vanish. One bright afternoon, she visited the Beltline with a friend, walking along the urban trail that threaded through parks and neighborhoods. As they passed a mural celebrating civil rights heroes, Rachel felt a swell of emotion. Courage and justice had roots in this city's history, and in her own small way, she'd contributed to that legacy. In the meantime, Mark and Elaine Brooks worked diligently to finalize case files, ensuring no stone remained unturned. Once the case moved to the courts, Mark would likely be called to testify about Carver's threat that night. as well as the broader evidence of corruption. Each day, he balanced the tasks of detective work with the emotional toll of the Carver saga. But for all the upheaval, there was a sense of renewal in the air. With Carver's toxic influence removed, departmental morale began to improve. Officers who'd felt stifled or afraid to speak up now felt emboldened to follow protocols, to question dubious actions. The system, though still flawed, was shifting toward transparency. One evening, as Mark and Rachel shared a quiet dinner at home steak for him, grilled vegetables for her, he tapped his glass of iced tea lightly. "To us," he said with a gentle smile, "and to doing what's right, no matter the cost." Rachel tapped her glass against his, "To the hope that others will do the same." In that toast, they acknowledged the hard-won victory and the bruises it left behind. But they also welcomed a new dawn, one in which an ordinary couple's stand against injustice helped illuminate the path toward a fairer, safer Atlanta. In the end, a seemingly routine traffic stop became the catalyst for exposing a toxic culture that thrived on power and intimidation. Rachel Carter's frightening encounter with Officers Carver and Milton revealed the depths of corruption within the Atlanta Police Department, and her husband Mark's unwavering stand for justice paved the way for reform. Carver faced charges that shattered his aura of invincibility, while the department took long overdue steps to restore public trust. Thank you for following this dramatic journey of courage, accountability, and redemption. If you found the story inspiring, please show your support by hitting the like button, sharing this video, and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement helps us shine a spotlight on issues that matter, reminding us that ordinary people have the power to demand integrity and that one act of defiance can spark a chain reaction leading to real change. Together, let's keep seeking truth and championing justice.